The glass exploded inward with the polite sound of ice cracking, a crystalline whisper that felt like accusation against the quiet of Lena Alvarado's attic. Frost raked across the wooden floorboards where the pale hand had tapped the window, 3 soft, deliberate knocks, and when she turned the lamplight, the shadow the hand had carved against the night. A boy's face hovered inches from the glass, narrow and impossibly young. His skin so pale it looked like moonlight folded into flesh. His eyes were not the brown she had expected from any guest at the weathered observatory. They were lunar and alien, rimmed with a color she could not name, reflecting the dishes outside as if they'd watched entire constellations instead of gulls. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds, if this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. Lena's first breath left her like smoke. For 2 winters, the observatory had been the shape of her grief. Neat routines, measured movements, an arithmetic of survival that reduced the yawning absence of her parents to a list she could tick off. Calibrate the seismometer at dawn. Log the radio noise at noon. Check the propane tank, light the stove, chain the hatch at dusk. The trailer that had been their home and their grave crouched at the edge of the property like a small weather-beaten animal, its single scarred window a mirror of the night the fire took them. She had gone back inside only twice since, once to pull out a half-burned notebook with her father's delicate annotations about pulsar timing, and once to run her fingers along the charred metal of the sink until the sensation of heat made the memory ache into her teeth. Mostly she lived in the observatory itself, among the dishes and the drift of charts, letting the instruments sing so she didn't have to. No one came knocking at Lena's window. Even the sea kept its distance these years, retreating in low tides as if afraid of making noise. So when the boy pressed his palm flat to the glass and smiled, an expression that didn't belong on any wanted poster or census record she had ever seen, Lena felt the rules she'd been living by tilt. She crossed the attic in a few long strides, the soles of her boots silent on insulation. The boy's breath fogged the inside of the pane. His laugh was a private thing, an untranslatable vibration behind his teeth. "Please," he said. The word was smaller than his face, layered with accents that slipped like light through prisms when he spoke. When he touched the biomodulator at the hollow of his chest, where a thin line of blue showed beneath the skin, the device hummed like a bee injured by cold. He mouthed a different name into it, something soft and syllabic that melted into a code. But when he looked at her, he told her one English word: Aaron. Lena's hands tightened on the latch before she had decided to open it. Her breath smoked. The attic smelled of solder and salt and last night's tea. Habit and terror had trained her fingers to check the outdoor cameras first, then peer through the chain before opening the door. But his face, so incredulous and raw in the pale porch light, unhinged routine. "How did you get up here?" she asked, the question a tool to steady herself against the surreal. He tilted his head in a gesture that could have been either apology or bewilderment. "Window," he answered, and the arc of his eyes danced over the chain and the padlock as if he had intended to knock on the side door but forgotten which side of the world he inhabited. His voice carried the faintest metallic undertone, a trace of the biomodulator's modulation if Lena's ears listened long enough. He smelled of ozone and something floral that had no name in her mind. "Cold," he added. "I was thinking, you have heat." She opened the door a hair and let the chain click. Wind tore at her unbuttoned flannel like a living thing. The boy's smile vanished in the draft, replaced with something sharper, more urgent. Up close, there were details. The iridescent flecks beneath the skin at his temples, the way his pupils dilated like tiny moons when the attic light stung them. He wasn't a child actor lost from a film set. He was engineered, crafted for endurance. The biomodulator nestled against bone, a foreign heartbeat she could not measure, and every instinct the years had taught her about being careful with strangers hummed like empty radiation meters. "There are 3 dishes with ice on them," he said, as if reading the instruments by sight, "and the midband is open." He slid one hand into his jacket as if feeling for some unseen weight, and then, with a sudden self-consciousness, withdrew it. "You have maps," he said, softer. "Stars." Her lips split in what might have been a smile, or the closest thing to civility she reserved for the living. "This is mostly listening," Lena said. Not a museum." The words tumbled out looking for purchase. "Who are you, really? Where did you come from? And what happened to your shoes?" His laugh broke something in her, the way sunlight through glass does. It refracted into memories she hadn't let herself hold. "Shoes get stuck," he said, as if that explained eons. "Ship, out there." He lifted his chin to the black slab of sky. "We were watching." The attic felt both too small and vast around them. Lena studied him the way she read star charts. She wanted coordinates, an origin, anything that fit the universe she'd been cataloging since she was 8. But Aaron's answers were textures rather than maps. Gesture, sound, half-phrases. He said that he was an emissary, that his team had been detached to observe, that something had gone very wrong, and their vessel had drifted beyond intended support. He said the biomodulator was not simply a translator, but a part of him, like a pulse line that connected him to other minds. And when he touched it, the light under his ribs flared in a slow, measured rhythm. He called his companions kin, and other words that made Leanna's chest clench with an ache she couldn't name. Lost, hunger, memory threading. Grief has a way of bending people toward one another like vines toward light. Leanna remembered the night the trailer had burned, the way the orange lick had eaten curtains and wallpaper, the sirens too far away to matter, the smell of smoke like a thing that could be tasted and cataloged. She knew how easy it was to mistake heat for rescue. She also knew something else, something dangerous, about clever men in suits who rattled her parents' names in classified files in rooms with sealed doors. 2 winters ago, she had followed a rumor into a bureau building and had been turned away by a clipboard and a smile. She had never meant to tattle, but she had known enough to be curious, and curiosity had a price. Her father had said once, with a tenderness that lasted after his voice didn't, that secrets are heavy, and you either grow strong under them, or they crush you. Aaron sat on the battered trunk beneath the window, as if he'd been there a dozen times before, and his knees made no sound against rough wood. "You live with ghosts," he remarked, looking not at the trailer, but at the star charts pinned along the slanted wall. His finger traced a line of ink where her father's handwriting had wavered, and for the first time since the fire, Leanna felt a hand, human or otherwise, touch that grief without flinching. "Why do you stay?" "Because someone fixed what they could and left the rest broken," she said. "Because my parents, their voices fill the house, and the absence is louder if I leave. Because the dishes keep me company." The answer surprised her by how honest it sounded. She did not tell him how many nights she had sat on the roof watching for things that never returned, or how many mornings she had woken with the sense that if she did not keep the instruments tuned, the world might slide away. Aaron's eyes softened. "Silence is a kind of instrument too," he said, as if he'd learned the phrase by listening to her quarters. "It can be tuned to hold memory, but it can also be tuned to listen." He reached out then, hesitantly, and tapped the side of her forearm the way one presses a key. The contact was light, but it sent a small bell of recognition ringing through Lena's chest. It wasn't physical consolation so much as it was acknowledgement, like a radio confirming a link, and she found herself telling him things that had been carved into the bones of the house. She offered him tea because she did not know what else to offer a stranded emissary. The kettle hissed and the small kitchen filled with steam. And for a miraculous moment, the absurdity of the situation settled into a domestic rhythm. 2 cups on a chipped tray, the radio murmuring in the background with static and the occasional intelligence of the universe. He listened to the static like it was story, his pale fingers tracing the rim of the cup as if feeling its temperature told him the weather. When Aaron spoke, his English was precise and slow-mo, shaped around strange idioms with the care of someone learning to love a language. "I need to be found," he said finally, voice stripped of the playfulness that had kept him buoyant at the window. "Not by those who hunt, by those who remember my kind. I was seated. I carried records." He tapped the biomodulator. "Records are tied to me. They can be taken." Lena's pulse clicked against her teeth like a small, frightened animal. The observatory was exactly the sort of place government eyes like to hover over. An old building with radio dishes, a woman alone with sensitive equipment, a family name that had once meant something in classified corridors. Her parents had known more than they'd let her hold. Lena had not untangled all of it. Grief and bureaucratic threats had kept her from finishing what she started. "If they come," she said, each word a hinge, "I will not hand you over." The boy's expression flickered, something between hope and astonishment. "You have nothing to gain," he murmured. In that small sentence was an accusation she would not fully untangle for some time. A gentle, surgical recognition that people like her often traded safety for something else. Loyalty, love, the stubborn insistence on naming what had been taken. Outside, the Atlantic breathed a cold wind that rattled the satellite dishes and sent a hollow sound through the observatory's bones. Somewhere down by the coast, headlights would sweep at dawn, and maybe a black SUV would note the observatory's silhouette in their logbooks. Lena knew how such things started. A missing file, a sensor that registered a frequency too pure to be natural, a call to investigate anomalous activity. For now, there was tea and a boy with moons for eyes and a chest that glowed when he whispered into something metallic beneath his ribs. The rules had shifted. The careful, geometric life Lena had built to protect herself had a new variable, impossible to solve with instruments alone. When Aaron smiled later, genuine and wide in the dim, Lena felt the first thaw of a winter she had thought permanent. It did not erase the ache. It added a new dimension to it, a temptation that made the air around her hum with both promise and peril. She set the second cup down and watched him drink, feeling like someone who had been given a map in a language they almost recognized. She kept her hands visible on the table, an old habit against surprises, as if the steadiness of her fingers could hold back everything that might want to shift them, from bureaucrats in suits to emissaries from other stars. "Stay by the dishes," Aaron said suddenly, eyes on the small sunburst of light over the main parabola. "They tell the truth. They listen." He spoke as if confiding a sacred secret. For the first time since the fire, Lena allowed herself to imagine a purpose that wasn't carved from loss. It felt dangerous and luminous in equal measure. At night, when the wind took up the dish's low song, Lena lay awake and tried to count the ways trust could be broken. Aaron slept on the floor beneath the charts, the biomodulator a dim throb under his shirt like a second pulse. Between them lay a very human thing, a notebook her mother had kept with lists of small domestic mercies, soup recipes, how to mend a torn sleeve, what to do when the propane smelled faintly of rotten eggs. Lena found herself reading those pages aloud in the dark, so the boy would know there was a world where people passed kindness forward for no reason other than love. In the morning, the sky over the ocean looked like a sheet of iron. The dishes hummed and scratched at the hush. Lena went about her calibration the way a priest goes about rites, precise and reverent. Aaron watched from the doorway, learning gestures and vocabulary as if pulling them into his bones.
When he touched the edge of a chart, coloring his fingers by tracing graphs, Lena realized that this fragile, impossible household had started not with romance, but with the mutual barter of needs: shelter for knowledge, stories for instruments. It was unsteady, like ice newly formed, but it was also a kind of repair that the observatory had not known since the days before the fire, when her parents' voices were ordinary furniture.
Somewhere inside the thin geometry of routines, a wild variable had arrived. Pale hand at the window, biomodulator beneath a fragile skin. A boy who called himself Aaron and who carried the weight of other worlds in his chest. It promised answers, and it promised danger. Lena was already measuring the risk as if it were a sample on a slide, but she also found herself, absurdly, saving a place for his cup on the chipped tray. The dishes outside kept singing. The radio static held fragments of conversations from the deep. And in the attic, where frost had once been the grammar of solitude, something impossible had begun to speak back. The first thing Lena realized was that the observatory's quiet could be negotiated. The second thing was that Aaron negotiated back. They divided the day into small territories. Mornings belonged to the instruments and to the frictionless ritual of making sense of noise. Afternoons belonged to patchwork tasks, fixing frayed wires, stapling annotations into ragged binders, airing out the trailer like a secular prayer. Nights belonged to questions, the ones that came sudden and raw and did not fit on any clipboard. At first, those questions were practical. How had he climbed the drainpipe without breaking bone? How did his biomodulator interpret idioms that bent grammar into music? But the practical quickly dissolved into the unnameable. What did it mean to be made to witness when you had nowhere to return? What did it mean to carry memory encoded to a chest like a physical thing? Aaron watched the dishes with a reverence Lena would have reserved for relics. He could sit for hours, knees folded, describing to her in soft, recursive sentences how different frequencies tasted to him. Low frequencies, he said, were like basalt and old iron. High ones were like glass and rain. She listened the way people listen to confessions, careful not to interrupt the architecture of pain or pride that built itself between his phrases. When he spoke of his crew, softly, with names that arrived in different cadences, the silhouette of loss behind his words matched hers. They were both survivors who had learned small, efficient ways to carry absence. "Do you miss home?" she would ask sometimes, because the question felt like a basic instrument, like a wrench or a tuning fork. "It depends on which home," he would answer, and she knew then that his memory was not a single geography, but a layered archive. For Aaron, home might be a ship humming in the dark, the scent of recycled air threaded with engineered flora, the precise rhythm of other bodies sharing a hull. For Lena, home was the trailer's crooked window and the way her mother's hands smelled of lemon oil. They had different languages for the same thing, the ache of continuity pulled apart. The first obstacle was small and terrestrial. A technician from the county, uniform stiff and polite, arrived with a clipboard and questions about licensing for the observatory's outdoor dishes. Lena met him at the gate and talked in a guarded, circular way about permits and maintenance because she knew the curiosity of bureaucrats tended to ripple outward toward departments who kept lists. Aaron watched from the shadow of the dish like someone learning the choreography of suspicion. When Lena told the technician the dishes were educational outreach for a defunct university program, his pen hovered and then moved on. For the moment, they had been inspected and passed. The next obstacle was less oblique. A low-flying drone hovered at dawn, a bright speck against the iron gray of an ocean sky, and then another at dusk, as if the world were testing the observatory's edges. On the second evening, Lena found a footprint in the gravel by the service road, a boot print refined and new, pointing toward the trailer. She took photographs, cataloged them. The footprints felt like a promise she wished would not be kept. Aaron's movement in the observatory was both graceful and clumsy.
The hybrid's body used uncommon joints to reach shelves, and his fingers sometimes brushed a circuit board the way a child might trace a toy's seams. He learned to brew coffee by watching Lena and then imitating. His fingers stained with grounds the first time he tried, and he developed small superstitions. Never to touch the worn spot where Lena's father used to rest his palm on the control console. Always to leave one chair pulled out, even unlikely to be used. At night, he would read aloud from a packet of her mother's notes she had left open on the kitchen table, and his voice would soften unfamiliar syllables into lullabies for a house still smelling faintly of smoke. They shared other rituals by accident. Lena taught him how to knot rope loops so a line wouldn't chafe a satellite, and Aren taught her a string of syllables that calmed interference in the midband when whispered into the biomodulator. The device had an appetite for certain frequencies, an attunement Lena could see in the way its glow pulsed, and when Aren fed it whispered phrases, it sometimes returned with patterns that could be coaxed into usable telemetry. They began to piece together fragments of a puzzle neither had the whole picture for. A spectral pattern that had been recorded near the coast around the time of the trailer fire. A signature that matched one of the file fragments Lena had once seen in a locked cabinet at the bureau. Every time the biomodulator pulsed in response, a thrill of illicit possibility hummed through Lena like electricity. Possibility is a dangerous companion in a world where some people trade it for power. The first clear threat came one gray morning when Lena was calibrating the array and the radio suddenly caught a whisper of a language she did not know. The sound made the hair at the nape of her neck stand up, harmonic, layered. Aren, who had been cataloging a chart beside her, froze and went very still. His hand found the biomodulator, and the light under his ribs blushed a color Lena had not yet seen, deep and sharp like crushed berries. "Listen," he breathed. Lena adjusted the receiver until the sound sharpened. It was a message, or an attempt at one, splintered by static and by someone or something trying to disguise its origin. The pulse had signatures Aren recognized as a recall code used for his people's short-range beacons, an activation pattern for those trying to home in on their own. Lena felt a dangerous hope volley through her. If it were true, Aren's kin might be searching for him, or for whatever had gone missing with the reconnaissance platform. But other possibilities nested inside that danger. Signal intercepts, jamming, and the attention of men with access to budget lines and contempt for privacy. "That could be them," Lena said, playing a careful game with her voice. Her palms were suddenly slick against the console. "Or it could be someone imitating them." Aren's response was a study in restraint. "They don't call that way," he said. "Not this distorted. Someone tries to hide. They may find us anyway." His jaw tightened. Lena noticed a sliver of something like grief cross his face, but sharper, edged with worry for those lost. They adjusted the dishes to a different band and logged the signature. Lena copied raw data onto a pair of old flash drives and hid them in a hollow of the observatory's furnace housing, a place her father used to tuck things too dear to burn. They moved with the quiet urgency of conspirators, reshelving documents, wiping prints, making their lives a patchwork of evasive gestures. But secrets in a coastal town rarely stay buried. A woman named Marta, a neighbor who ran the grocery and once watered their parents' lawn when they were away, came by with a casserole and warm, prying eyes. At first, Marta pretended her visit was about food and small talk, but when Aren opened his mouth and mangled Lena's language with endearing bluntness, Marta's smile did not reach the corners of her face. Her eyes flicked over the biomodulator unnoticed as she asked about the boy's past. "You're young to be alone, sugar," Marta said to Lena, leaning on the counter like she owned the space. Her voice had the soft hardness of someone used to knowing more than was comfortable, and when Lena asks how she found them, Marta shrugged like a woman who had seen signals in neighborhood gossip before and knew how tiny sparks grew into fires. Folks talk. Aren, who had been pouring coffee, flinched so hard he spilled.
The cup clattered, and Marta's hands were suddenly on his forearm, steadying him, not with rough inquiry, but with something that looked like calculation feeding into maternal concern. She asked him where he was from, and he tilted his head as if trying to choose the correct shape of a memory. "He's not from round here," Marta said eventually, and the way she said it made Lena feel suddenly small, like a child who had been found out. Marta left after a while, her casserole untouched, but her expression delivering the news that the town had noticed. She said nothing about file cabinets or agencies, but in her eyes, Lena saw the reflection of a car's headlights, a glint of interest that could translate to anyone who knew how to listen. After she left, the observatory felt colder, as if someone's breath had been taken from the room. "What will you do if they come?" Aaron asked, when the door had clicked and the windows had been latched. Lena stared at the parabolic dishes visible through the grimy windows. Their silhouettes were like listening ears against the dawn. "I will do what I always do," she answered. "I will make a plan. Plans are scaffolding for people who do not want to be moved by chance." Their plan was brutal in its simplicity. Bury the evidence. Make the place look less interesting. Make themselves look like two fools living at the edge of nowhere. They would take down the larger dish to a skeleton state, create a story about old equipment, about the rust and expense of upkeep. Meanwhile, Aaron would practice moving at dusk, hiding in the reel of coastal scrub that bowed toward the sea, until he could climb and hide in roofs and hollow spaces without leaving tracks that men in boots could translate. In the silence that followed, they rehearsed whispers. Lena taught him how to call the landline if trouble came, which numbers to call and in what order, and how to make the phone's voice sound like a stubborn old woman who had nothing to do but watch the tides. Aaron taught her how to read the pulsing of his biomodulator. Bright and quick meant recall, slow and deep meant sleep, and how to hold him when the patterns of the sky made his chest feel like a bell. They kept mapping one another like fragile constellations, connecting dots with trembling lines. Their bond, practical at first, began to thicken with trust. Trust is the currency that breaks most easily in a world of hidden agendas, but it was also the thing they could afford in order to survive. Lena caught herself more than once stealing glances at Aaron as he slept with the biomodulator's light dim against his skin. She watched the way his shoulders rose and fell and allowed herself, absurdly, to think about the smell of his hair when the wind tugged it loose from his head. She rehearsed names for things she had no right to name yet. Friend, ally, maybe someday something like love. And then the county officer who had signed off on their dishes called back, asking for a meeting. He said he had an inspector who would like to ensure the public safety compliance of the observatory. He used the word compliance with a smile Lena could hear across the phone, a soft synonym for examination. He set a time in 3 days. 3 days dissolved into immediate preparation. Lena taped over floorboards that clicked too loudly, packed the trailer with the illusion of domestic normalcy, buried flash drives, and rehearsed the script she would tell the inspector, that the dishes were obsolete, purely educational, and that no alien emissary would be found here because none existed. Aaron, who did not have the practice of lying to men in suits, practiced too, memorizing a name and a birthplace to offer, the sort of rural details that mended curiosity into banality. Sometimes he faltered, and Lena had to step in to smooth him out, to fabricate the small, ordinary miseries of human life so that his presence would not feel like evidence. It was a strange intimacy, shaping the truth into a story both of them could perform. It tightened something between them, the shared knowledge of deception, the weight of what would happen if the performance failed. On the night before the inspection, the wind blew so hard the dishes sang like a choir of rusted bells, and every small noise in the observatory seemed to swell into significance. Lena lay awake thinking of the trailer, of charred metal and hollowed-out rooms. Aaron's breathing beside her was slow and steady, the biomodulator's pulse a dim, dependable glow.
She found herself imagining futures where the inspector shrugged, accepted their story, and drove away. She also imagined futures where men with badges came with warrants and flashlights and a legal precision that carved flesh. She tried to sleep and failed, listening to the ocean breathe. The thought that refused to loosen its hold was this: whatever happened, she could not, would not, trade Aaron for answers. That certainty felt like a rope wrapped around her ribs, taut and raw. It was not a noble feeling. It was simple and honest. She had been alone for 2 winters and had learned how to survive. She would not surrender another life to make hers comprehensible.
Outside, the dishes kept humming, and the radio scratched at the edges of the night, carrying voices that might be divine or very small. Inside, 2 people held their breath for the next knock and the next choice. The inspector came like a rumor made manifest, a sedan with dark-tinted windows that smelled faintly of electronics and citrus. The man in a pressed jacket who smiled as if he were offering a tour rather than a search. He arrived with papers that smelled of machine ink and certainty. And with him came a second presence, an agent Lena recognized from corridors she had tried to enter 2 winters ago, the one who had given her an almost patient look and shut the door. He had the kind of face that recorded everything and forgave nothing. They spoke in small, polite sentences that were full of the thud of waiting things: warrants, audits, curiosity dressed up as law. Aaron watched from the corner of the control room as they walked the dishes' perimeters and tapped the radomes. His fingers flexed around the biomodulator until the plastic creaked softly. He looked like a creature shifting in an unfamiliar light, waiting to be declared dangerous. Marta came by again that morning with pies and an air of apology, but the apology was small, and when the inspector's pen hovered over lines in his forms, her eyes were not on the pies. They were on the observatory's skirts where the grass curled underfoot. Lena caught Marta's glance and felt something jolt inside her that she could not name: suspicion, betrayal, relief, an ugly braid of emotions. They asked questions: ownership of the dishes, source of power, baseline noise levels, whether the research conducted here had any institutional oversight. Lena answered with the economy of someone rehearsed. She handed over photocopies, legends of defunct grants, an email thread she had forged with careful hands to suggest academic oversight. The inspector ran a finger down a ledger and looked up at her as if testing. "And your neighbor," he said, "did they notice any unusual activity? Any visitors?" Lina's mouth made the practiced line of someone used to half-truths. "Only travelers now and then," she said. Her voice was flat enough to hold a hidden knife. Aaron, who had never been told how to lie with a human face, fell silent and watched the men with a kind of terrible fascination. The agent from the bureau smiled the smile of someone who had gotten good at making other people's lies feel small. When the men moved to check the trailer, Lina felt a hot animal panic lift her from the center of her chest and set it to running. It was irrational and precise all at once. The fear that they would find the charred notebook, the old stack of invoices that led to names in committees, the half-burned note her father had kept about a frequency that matched the one Aaron's biomodulator sometimes hummed to. She had hidden things in the furnace, in the false bottom of a milk crate, in the hollow of a beam. People who keep secrets learn how to build a house from lies and memory. She had learned too well. The agent asked if he might take a look at the attic, and Lina felt the floor tilt beneath her. "Please," she said, and opened a door into a world she feared would end with a hand on the shoulder and a polite apology for intrusion. Aaron followed her like a shadow that had not yet learned the human margin of stepping back. It was Marta who betrayed them. Not deliberately. No one who leaves a handrail becomes an informant by artistry, but by worry. She had not meant to speak with the agent beyond the polite, neighborly complaints about weather and loose shingles, but the men were persuasive,
and Marta's guilt at having visited with the casserole swelled until she could not hold it down. "There's been a strange boy asking about the dishes," she said, voice a crooked blade wrapped in concern. "Boy's pale as a gull."
Folks around here, you know. The words were a net thrown without malice, but the men took them as instructions. They found the biomodulator before Lena could think to hide it under a floorboard. An agent with clean gloves held it up like an object at the center of a theological debate. It hummed faintly, and the light under Aaron's ribs dimmed then brightened in a way that felt like a reprimand. "What is this?" the inspector asked. His hands were gentle. His voice was the kind of velvet used to unwrap cold things. "It is his," Lena said, the sentence propping itself up on fear. "It makes translation." It was the kind of clumsy truth that exposes more than it hides. The agent smiled in exactly the way a spider's mouth works when it has found resourceful prey. "We should catalog it," he said, "for science, for safety." The bureau agent's fingers closed around the device, and the world narrowed to a point of acute, hot conscience. Aaron moved like a snapped wire. His body launched toward the man with a grace that looked trance-like, as if anger from another galaxy had been rehearsed and then released. He reached for the biomodulator, his hands almost touching the agent's gloves. The agent's sleeve brushed Aaron's wrist, and the boy flinched as if struck. The biomodulator was plucked from the air and cradled like a prize. The man in the jacket, whose smile had been clinical, spoke the word that Lena had feared. "Secure." "Don't," Aaron said in a voice raw as torn paper. It was a different language, no translation, only sound of grief and warning. Lena watched him shrink back as the men moved with the efficiency of trained scavengers. They radioed for a vehicle to transport the device. They asked for names and identification and backup. The observatory, which had only ever listened to the sky, found itself cataloged by men who wrote over it with black ink. Later, they would present their paperwork with the solemnity of those who remove a splinter before the patient can cry. They would tell stories of protocols and public safety and necessary seizures. For now, the agents had what they wanted. They took the biomodulator, they pocketed a handful of Lena's father's notes as related paraphernalia, and they left behind a cold hush and a legal form Lena had to sign that felt like a confession. Aaron did not leave with them. That merciful detail felt small and sharp as a coin. He crouched on the floor afterward, hands wrapped around his knees, and the glow where his device had been seemed to move inside him like a ghost flame. His eyes were glassy and far away, and when he looked at Lena, there were so many things to rescue from his face. Grief, accusation, a kind of primitive human fear that had nothing to do with alien doctrines. "They touched it," he said. "They saw." "They'll poke and they'll listen," she replied, the words brittle. The truth, brutal and familiar, was that the Bureau had ways of talking to metal like it was an oracle. Once a device began to sing in government hands, its secrets seldom returned to the people who made it sing. Lena could see the machinery inside the agent's smiles, how lightly they balanced coercion and care. She had been in halls like these before and recognized the choreography of consent they mastered. A promise to help, a request for cooperation, a subtle recalibration of what was voluntary into what was obligatory. Aaron's face crumpled in something that was not wholly human. "They will learn and not tell," he said. "They will cut records and hide them in places that rust forgets." Lena's response was a confession she had not planned to make. "I once pointed someone toward a file," she said. The sentence landed like a stone. "Years back, I thought—" She stopped. The admission had the small, sharp smell of betrayal, even as she owned it. Aaron's body pulled inward as if a hand had closed around his chest. "I never meant," she started, and then another reality uncoiled. The agent's mild face had hosted restraint and the machinery of taking. "I did it because I was foolish, because I wanted to know. Because I thought knowledge would make the world less heavy. I didn't think about what they would do with it." The silence stretched between them like an old rope, weathered and fraying. For a long beat, both of them practiced avoidance, breathing, counting, listening to a dish exempt from the day's commotion. Finally, Aaron pushed his hands into his hair, that foreign gesture of frustration, and said, Does that mean you sent them here?" Lena felt the color drain from her. The thought that her own past mistake might have led to the present ruin was a weight that made her stomach hollow with nausea. "No," she said, and then the lie tasted like rust. She could not tell if she was trying to protect herself from blame or from the sudden impossibility that she had been the architect of this fracture. "I didn't know they'd find you," she whispered instead. Aaron's eyes hardened with a hurt that was not altogether distant from her own. "You said you would not hand me over," he said. For the first time in days, his English did not carry carefulness. It carried the bluntness of someone whose trade had been betrayed. "You promised." "I did," Lena said. The room tilted. Memories of small, safe routines recoiled like shadows. "I didn't hand you over." She wanted to say that she had tried to be steadfast, that she had hidden what she could, that the agents had been skilled and bureaucratic, and that sometimes paper and gloves and suits were better at taking things than any human plan. She wanted to say anything that would stitch the torn place between them, but words in that thin air felt like inadequate tools. "They took the thing," she finished, voice broken. The fracture in Aaron's face deepened. "Your past brings them," he said. It was not an accusation meant to wound. It was a fatal calculus, a cold observation. "You showed them the map. They always follow maps." Lena's throat closed. The truth hurt like a raw edge. It was a mirror reflecting not only her own faults, but the way her wounds had called predators like moths to a porch light. She wanted to throw back the world and claim culpability, or to hide behind the fiction that fate had simply gone unexpected. Instead, she reached out and touched the hollow where the biomodulator had been, feeling absence in the way one feels for a missing tooth. "I won't give you up," she said, and the promise felt both inadequate and absolute. "I will get it back." He pulled away as if her touch burned him. "You promised," he said again, eyes turning cold as a distant star. "You promised before you knew this." They sat in the observatory with the dishes like silent, accusing heads around them, and the machines hummed with voices they could not wholly understand. The legal forms lay on the table, arranged by protocol, authorizing removal and custody. Marta's casserole, now cold, sat like an accusation on the counter. Somewhere, a sedan had driven away, and the smell of citrus and the soft echo of men who cataloged everything. Lena felt the geometry of her life splintering. Lines she had drawn to keep the world predictable were becoming jagged, and where they intersected now, they bled. Aaron stood abruptly and left the room without a word. The slamming of the attic door was like a verdict. Lena sat with paperwork that smelled like old paper and failure, and the observatory felt suddenly like a place that had been breached. Secrets had been found and fractured. Relationships had been stretched to breaking. The knock at the window that had once promised rescue now felt like a prelude to judgment. They had both been carrying scars and loyalties across species and grief, but the theft changed everything. What had been a fragile shelter now had a hole through which the world exerted pressure. When she finally went after him, Aaron was on the roof, staring at a sky that refused to give simple answers. He did not look at her when she climbed up beside him. His profile was a landscape of withheld sorrow. "They will take other things," he said after a long while. "They will ask for names. "Then we will not give them names," Lena replied, which was both defiance and the start of a plan that might cost everything. Her voice trembled with the knowledge that to protect what was left, she might have to betray the last fragility of her own conscience. Aaron laughed, a sound thin as cracked ice. "You already did," he said. The accusation landed like an icicle. For a moment, they were both outside themselves, two beings who had begun as barter partners, who had become something more complicated and dangerous to both of their worlds. The fracture between them was not only the lost device or the agent's polite hands, it was the revelation that history had a way of chasing people down, that past actions make maps other people can read, and that love, no matter how fierce, sometimes maps you into corners where there is no easy exit. They sat under a sky that had once felt endless and found that the horizon now bore lines and borders. Secrets had been exposed, trust had been cracked. The observatory had listened and been answered in the language of consequence. And between Lena and Aaron, a thin, bitter distance opened, raw, honest, and full of the promises they had both already broken. They sat on the cold roof while the ocean hissed like a thing that had been waiting to be useful. Lena could feel the scrape of salt in the seams of her jacket and the tiny, stubborn determination that had kept her alive after the fire. She thought of the way the agents had cradled the biomodulator like a chalice, of the bureaucrat's velvet voice promising safety, as if safety could be made of clipboards and plastic gloves. The promise she had made to Aaron now had the weight of a tidal pull. She could feel it drawing her toward a choice she had not yet made. "I will get it back," she said again. But this time she let the words mean more than stubborn comfort. She tasted strategy in them. "I have contacts who owe old favors," she added, "people who used to work in labs. I can borrow tools, make fake manifests. I can make them look at the wrong things long enough for us to take it." Aaron turned his head and finally looked at her. The moonlight traced the line of his jaw. For a moment, his alien face was an unreadable map. Then the softening came, an unraveling that felt like a concession and a plea simultaneously. "You are human," he said. It wasn't an observation so much as recognition. You set plans like nets. You set them because you hope someone will fall into them. "You're not giving me enough credit," Lena shot back, because anger was easier than the ache. "I worked at the bureau. I know their rhythms." He laughed, and the sound was brief and oddly kind. "Then you know they are precise. You must become imprecise." She held on to that paradox until it shaped itself into a plan. Misdirection for the inspectors, a public performance of compliance that would draw resources away from the vault where they kept alien things. Marta's casserole would be a prop, the county inspector's forms a stage. They would create an emergency elsewhere, an alarm that required immediate, visible attention. While men in suits ran toward the noise, a small, quiet team would move like ghosts. "You can't go into the facility," Aaron said, voice low. "Your name is in their files." "Then you come with me," Lena said, before she could soften it. She had never been good at saying the gentler sentences when action needed to be done. "You're small. You can move in vents, slip through locks with different joints. You have tech in you we don't understand. If anyone can get close, you can." Aren's eyes filled with something like fear and pride braided together. "If I go, I risk recall," he whispered. The biomodulator's theft was not only a loss of memory, it was a breach of people who had trained to track their own. "They will call for retrieval. They will send seekers. I could be taken out of the world, you know." "You could be taken regardless," Lena said. "Or you could be taken and we could try to take it back." Her hand found the cold of his and held it with a human steadiness. "I won't lose you to bureaucracy."
He squeezed back, a small, alien pressure that meant something fierce. "You promised not to hand me over," he said, softer now. "You promised." "I did," Lena said, "and I meant it. This is how I keep my promise. I get the thing back." They moved with the quick, hungry competence of two people who had practiced survival in separate universes. Lena called an old colleague, an engineer named Robert, who owed her a favor from a grant that never quite materialized. She lied with the precision of a practiced thing. Emergency maintenance on a nearby relay tower, a temporary diversion of law enforcement resources, a paper trail that looked like municipal panic. Robert agreed to create a smokescreen in exchange for a favor she would cash in the future. The plan stank of danger and improvisation, which somehow made Lena's heart pulse steadier than any chart she had ever read. On the night they chose, the observatory played its part. A wren stood sentinel by the dishes, an impossible silhouette against static-lit seas, while Lena waited for the signal. Her palms were not steady, but her voice was when she called Robert, delivering the code word that would trigger a cascade of false alarms up the coast. Relay breach. Sirens that were not theirs sang into the night a half-hour later. The inspectors and county men and half a dozen curious deputies drove away with blinking lights toward the staged crisis. The bureau agent who had smiled the spider smile left his overnight team to accompany them. He would not leave the town without a show. Lena felt the tiny, cold bloom of terror. If any one of them returned early, the plan was done. If she was caught, everything would crumple. Aaron watched the convoy until their taillights became a thin red thread swallowed by black. Then he moved with the silence of someone who had been trained in the hush between stars. He slipped through the low scrub and along the ridge of a roof, folded like a shadow into drainage pipes and broken gutters. Lena followed, carrying a small toolkit and the old keys of a man who trusted her once. The facility was a squat building on a service road, white and bureaucratic and humming with the indifferent light of fluorescence. Lena's badge, fake, printed, pressed into an envelope of plausibility, got them to the first barrier. The security guard at the gate was impatient with the staged chaos, but tired men sent on errands accept paper. They signed in. They walked the corridor that smelled of coffee and antiseptic. Lena's fingers shook, but her voice did not. They found the evidence room after an hour that felt like an orbit. It was a small, climate-controlled cell lined with shelves of sealed boxes and drawers labeled with the sort of dry care that tries to make everything lawful. The biomodulator sat beneath tempered glass in the center of a table, like an offering. It pulsed faintly, as if the thing remembered its lost place. Lena swallowed and felt a tide of grief, of rage, of something huge and cattle-phobic that wanted to take the room down with a single breath. Security was thinner than Lena had hoped. They'd timed it to the fake emergency, and the room's single guard was at the coffee station, phone to his ear. Aaron moved before she could think. He slid across the tiled floor with limbs that should not have fit through the narrow ventilation grate, but did, and he was at the table like a small predator that had memorized its prey. His fingers, surprising in their delicacy, pried the glass seal with a tool Lena had pilfered from a lab where she once worked. The lock gave with a sound like a sigh. The biomodulator hummed and then flared. Alarms shrieked as a backup sensor registered a breach. Lena's pulse lurched, but Aaron did not look back. He tucked the device to his chest, and the glow under his ribs regained a rhythm that steadied him. He looked at Lena with an expression that made her throat ache. "Now," he said, and it was not a question. They ran. The corridors were suddenly full of feet and fluorescent light and the thick human noise of things trying to catch what had escaped. Lena felt hands on her arm, the press of authority, the polite aggression of custody, and for a moment she saw the map of her life unspool. The trailer's char, the observatory's dishes, the nights of cataloging static for comfort, the window where a pale hand once tapped for mercy. She shoved like a woman with nothing left to lose. She met a suited man in a hallway and, with a rawness close to prayer, whispered into whatever human corner of him might respond. This is not a thing to take. He carries records of people who trusted us. If you take that, you take the moment when histories can be healed. His face was professional neutrality. It cracked for an instant with the reflection of bewilderment, maybe at the audacity of her plea, maybe at the shape of her desperation.
That brief flicker bought Aaron another heartbeat. He barreled through a side door and into the night, dragging wires and the smell of ozone with him. A flash of headlights flooded the stairwell as the convoy returned early. Lena felt a hand clamp her shoulder and another on the biomodulator where Aaron had held it the second before. The world narrowed to the press of palms and the sound of men cataloging theft. Lena met Aaron's eyes through the doorway, feral, gone fierce with gratitude and terror. He had his device. She had a choice that now had to be paid for. They tangled in the dark, two animals circled by those who kept lists. Aaron's fingers grazed hers, brief, electric. "Go," he mouthed, the word a command threaded through pleading. "Hide." Lena could have run then, saved herself like she had saved other pieces of her life. Instead, she stepped forward, putting her body between the agents and the boy who had become the only other heartbeat that had learned the pace of her grief. "Take me," she said, voice steady like a verdict. "If you want records, take me. Aaron is not part of your files." It was a sacrifice not of martyrdom, but of raw love, the human calculus of giving oneself for another to preserve what mattered. The agents debated in clipped sentences. The leader, his face a scar of compromise, looked at her with something like respect and the implacable logic of procedure. He read the risk and the public relations of taking a woman who had offered herself in place of an alien unknown. He signaled. Men moved. Aaron lunged and collided with Lena, reckless and pleading and incandescent. They clashed together, not like strangers, but like two halves of an alarm that had finally found the contact to ring true. The biomodulator flashed against Lena's chest in Aaron's arms, as if recognizing its true harbor. Then, in a blur of movement and noise, the device was jerked free by a gloved hand. Lena felt the loss like a physical blow, an unstitched seam in her ribs. She hit the floor and tasted iron. Aaron was wrestled back, his screams raw and untranslatable, but in the chaos, something cracked inside the agent's formation. Confusion, the human instinct to see faces rather than faceless objects. The leader hesitated, and in that hesitation, a sliver of mercy opened like a door. "What do you want?" he asked Lena, not as an interrogator, but as someone who, suddenly, had been offered an impossible bargain. "Time," she said, chest heaving. "Time to prove we aren't a threat. Time to show you what this means beyond your forms. Time to broker this. Don't you want a world where contact is governed by respect, not erasure?" Her voice trembled, but the sincerity in it was a weapon they were suddenly unarmed to discount. Aaron's eyes held hers, terrified, grateful, love made visible in a look that required no translation. The leader's jaw worked. Then, with a bureaucrat's reluctance and a human's curiosity, he made a choice neither of them expected. He ordered containment rather than immediate custody, a temporary truce that would let Lena and Aaron breathe long enough to build a different kind of answer. It was not a complete victory. The biomodulator was.